great pleasure to be here, and I feel honored to be asked to be here this evening. Let me start by saying that I agree completely with both what Cecilia said and what Carl said about the fact we live in a very dangerous world today. I'd put a finer point on it and say that I think the world is likely to get more dangerous with the passage of time. And number two, I believe that the world that we are moving into is more dangerous than the Cold War was. And of course, the Cold War was dangerous, but there's bigger trouble ahead. Now, the question is, why do I say that? I say that because you have to think about what the world looked like when World War II ended and how it's evolved over time. And you have to think about how the structure of the world has changed, because that tells you a great deal about the likelihood of conflict. When I was born in 1947, it was a bipolar world. There were two great powers in the system, the United States and the Soviet Union. When the Cold War ended in 1989, and certainly when the Soviet Union fell apart in December of 1991, we moved from a bipolar world to a unipolar world. Then around 2017, the structure of the system began to change, and we moved from unipolarity to multipolarity, a world where there are three great powers, the United States, China, and Russia. So if you think about it, in my lifetime, we went from bipolarity to unipolarity to multipolarity. Now, what this means is that in the multipolar world we're in now, we have what I would call two conflict dyads involving great powers. One is the US-China dyad, and the other is the US-Russia dyad. During the unipolar moment, you had no great power competition. Most of you young people in the audience were born in the unipolar moment. There was only one great power in the system in the unipolar moment, and you cannot have great power competition by definition when you have only one great power. In the bipolar world that I was born into, there were two great powers, and you had one conflict dyad, the United States and the Soviet Union. So what you see is today you have a major conflict dyad in Asia involving China and the United States, a major conflict dyad involving great powers here in Europe involving the United States and Russia. That's two conflict dyads versus one in the Cold War and none in the unipolar moment. Furthermore, war is more likely, security competition is more likely to turn into war in the US-China competition and in the US-Russia competition than it was during the Cold War. So what I'm saying to you is that we have more potential wars between great powers in the multipolar world we now live in, right? And furthermore, those wars are more likely. Now, why do I say that? I think what I have to do here is explain to you how I think about the security competition between the United States and China in East Asia. Just tell you what I think is going on there, and then talk about what's going on here in Europe in terms of the US-Russia competition. And of course, when I talk about the US-China competition, what I'm going to do is focus mainly on Taiwan. And when I focus on the US-Russia competition here in Europe, I'll focus mainly on Ukraine. And what I'm going to try and do is convince you that these are really dangerous situations. Now, with regard to US-China competition, what's happening here is that China is a peer competitor of the United States. If you were to rank order the three great powers in the system now, the United States remains the most powerful state on the planet. China is a close second, and there's great fear in the United States that they will eventually overtake us. And Russia is a distant third. Russia is a weak great power. There are a number of people who argue it shouldn't even be considered a great power. People should argue that we're in a bipolar world today that involves just the US and China. I don't agree with that. I think Russia is a great power, but it's the weakest of the three great powers. China's a potential hegemon. It's a potential hegemon in Asia. China is growing very powerful. And in international politics, when you grow very powerful, the ideal situation is to dominate your region of the world. It's to be a regional hegemon and to make sure that no other country on the planet, really no other great power on the planet, dominates its region of the world the way you dominate yours. And of course, the paradigmatic example of this is the United States of America. We are the only regional hegemon in the world. We dominate the Western Hemisphere. No American goes to bed at night worrying about any other country in the Western Hemisphere attacking us. Why? Because we are Godzilla. In the international system, you want to be Godzilla, and you want to make sure you're the only Godzilla on the planet. Well, the Chinese have figured this out. The Chinese want to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. The Chinese know full well what happens to you in international politics when you're weak. They call it the century of national humiliation. It runs from the late 1840s to the late 1940s. They were weak, and when they were weak, they were taken advantage of. You can rest assured that they want to make sure that they are by far the most powerful state in Asia, and you can rest assured that they'd like to get the Americans out beyond the first island chain, out beyond the second island chain, and far away from China. It's the best way to survive in international politics, to be a regional hegemon. And the Chinese are taking all that economic might they have and they're turning it into military might. Now, how are the Americans reacting to this? It's very clear. The Americans do not tolerate other regional hegemons in the system. The 20th century shows this very clearly. The United States played a key role in putting Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union on the scrap heap of history. We had no intention of letting any of those four countries dominate either Europe or Asia. You can rest assured, we have no intention of allowing China to dominate Asia. And in fact, we're not going to pursue a pure containment strategy. We're going to pursue a rollback strategy as well. We're going to try and weaken China the way we weakened the Soviet Union during the Cold War. We have our gun sights on the Chinese. The Chinese, of course, fully understand that, and they're going to great lengths to try to deal with us. And at the same time, as I said to you, the Chinese have a deep-seated interest in achieving regional hegemony. And the more powerful they grow economically, the better off they'll be at developing the military capability to achieve regional hegemony. This is why, of course, the United States is trying to slow down Chinese economic growth. So what you have in East Asia is an intense security competition between China and the United States. And the principal focus is on Taiwan. And Taiwan is a really dangerous situation. There is no analogous situation in the Cold War. The 1947 to 1989 Cold War. Berlin was not the equivalent of Taiwan. Why is Taiwan so dangerous? Taiwan is remarkably dangerous because, number one, the Chinese consider it sacred territory and they desperately want it back. Number two, the Americans believe firmly that for a variety of reasons, it's important that we not let China take Taiwan because it has great strategic value for us. So what's happening here is that the United States is now moving closer and closer to Taiwan. The Nancy Pelosi visit's just one indicator of how we're moving closer and closer to Taiwan. And this, of course, enrages the Chinese because this is sacred territory. This is nationalism at play. The Americans are preventing us from getting Taiwan back. So you have a lot of tension. And then the third reason is it's easy to imagine a Cold War in East Asia turning into a hot war over Taiwan because it would be a battle over an island in a huge body of water. During the Cold War, when Carl and I were young, it was hard to imagine starting a war in Central Europe because you had two massive armies with thousands of nuclear weapons in their inventory. And if those massive armies crashed into each other with all those nuclear weapons, we probably would have all gotten incinerated. So when we ran war games during the Cold War, it was very hard to get a war going in Europe because everybody understood what the consequences would be. It's much easier to imagine a war breaking out over Taiwan. It's a small island out in the middle of a large body of water. And by the way, the other 2 points of friction in East Asia are the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And you can imagine a war breaking out over those two bodies of water. So you see the different scenarios between the Cold War, Central Europe, and the new Cold War in East Asia between China and the United States over Taiwan or the South China Sea or the East China Sea. So there's big trouble coming in East Asia. I'm not arguing here that war is inevitable, but it is going to be very difficult to avoid that intense security competition turning into a real war.